I think especially for our audience members or those listening is really thinking about, given the current socio-political climate right now, specifically as we think about anti-immigrant and just a hostile climate for undocumented immigrants, our students, is that what will it take for us to build together while dismantling our current systems? Building together is going to take a lot of work. And I think people need to remember that this is work that those before us have done, right? It's not going to happen overnight. So again, what will it take for us to continue to build together collectively while dismantling our current systems?
Hello, and welcome to Student Affairs Now. I'm your host, Keith Edwards. Today, I'm joined by three scholars who have researched, thought about, and written about the experiences of undocumented students. Today's guests include the editor and two contributing authors of the new book, Equitable and Humanizing Research, Policy, and Practice with and for Undocumented Collegians in the United States. They're particularly focused on expanding the conversation around undocumented students in higher education. We'll be discussing the complexities of who these students are, their experiences, and how higher ed can better serve them. Thank you all for joining us today. Student Affairs Now is the premier podcast and online learning community for thousands of us who work in, alongside, or adjacent to the field of higher education and student affairs. We release new episodes every week on Wednesdays. Find details about this episode or browse our archives at studentaffairsnow.com. This episode is sponsored by Rutledge, Taylor, and Francis. View their complete catalog of education titles at rutledge.com/education. This episode is also sponsored by Huron, a global professional services firm that collaborates with clients to put possible into practice. As I mentioned, I'm your host, Keith Edwards. My pronouns are he, him, his. I'm a speaker, author, and coach, helping higher ed leaders and organizations advance learning, leadership, and equity. You can find out more about me at keithedwards.com. And I'm recording this from my home in Minneapolis, Minnesota, at the intersections of the ancestral homelands of both the Dakota and the Ojibwe peoples. I would love to get the conversation started and hear from some of our guests. Dr. Kayon Hall, we're going to start with you.
Hi, Keith. Thank you for having us here today. My name is Dr. Kayon Hall. I'm an assistant professor of higher education and student affairs at Kent State University, and my pronouns are she, her, hers, and I'm excited to be in community with you all today.
Great. Roseanne, we're going to go over to you.
Hi, everyone. Keith, thank you so much for, again, having us today on this podcast. My name is Dr. Roseanne Gutierrez. I use the pronoun she, her, hers, and I'm an assistant professor in the College of Education and Human Development at the University of Nevada, Reno.
Awesome. And Stefan.
Yes. Hi, folks. I'm so happy to share space with you all today. Dr. Stefan Santa Ramirez. I go by he, him pronouns. I'm an assistant professor of higher education at the University at Buffalo, which is on the unceded ancestral territory of the Haudenosaunee peoples. And yeah, I'm ready to get this started. Thank you so much for having us, Keith.
Awesome. So glad to have all of you here. Let's begin by framing this a little bit for folks who maybe are less familiar with issues of undocumented students. Can you give us a brief explanation of undocumented students and the issues they're facing, just to kind of ground this, and then we'll make it more complex from here. Roseanne, I think we're going to start with you.
Yeah, so I think before we even think about undocumented students and the experiences that they face on college campuses, it's really important for us to zoom out first and foremost to understand these concepts of legality, illegality, and documentedness within frameworks of power. So what I mean by that is that these terms are social constructs, that a lot of things in this world are socially constructed. So we as people have created these terms. And so again, when we think about, framing this conversation within the constructs of power, we have to ask ourselves, well, who has been able to construct these terms and who has been empowered to be able to do that, right? So again, as we think about legality and these and undocumentedness, you know, in the history of the United States, immigration and what we know today as immigration and immigration laws didn't really start until the early 1900s. And when we look at the U.S. timeline within the immigration timeline of the United States, there were not necessarily a lot immigration prior to the 1900s. Okay, and so again, let's bring it back to, you know, who has been able to construct these terms and these concepts. So when it comes to legality and undocumentedness, I often, whenever I introduce this topic to folks that have never heard these terms, or this is not necessarily part of their research, but they do care about undocumented students, right? So for example, when I talk about this in my class, I always show this picture of Jose Antonio Vargas, and he's a Filipino journalist, filmmaker, and he's undocumented. And so Jose Antonio Vargas there's this image of him speaking, and in the background, there is this image where it says, you know, apartheid was legal, slavery was legal, the Holocaust was legal, colonialism was legal. And again, when we think about all of those things, legality has not necessarily just been about, you know, how we think about it. It's always been this like who has been able to construct these terms in terms of power. So I think that's really important for us to understand, because the students that we serve and where they are at on campuses and how it impacts them, we really need to look at, you know, legal and state policies and who are in power constructing those laws that affect them.
Oh, I love it. You took us way back to the beginning, the broadest possible concept. Where do even these words come from?
Yeah.
I love it. Thank you for doing that. That's really important context for us. Pam, what would you add here?
Yeah, I'd also like to extend Roseanne's point, you know, that immigration policies in the US have always been exclusionary in nature, right? We see them looking at the Chinese Exclusionary Act. And so those are just some of the examples that have denied people the right to be in the United States. So it's not uncommon, it's not far-fetched to believe that we are here today. Just kind of like extending that, looking at it from an institutional level, we see that, you know, laws like the Plyer versus Doe of 1982 state that it was unconstitutional to prevent undocumented students, anyone actually, from getting a free education. So you find that undocumented students at the K through 12 level are not navigating the same kinds of challenges that folks at the higher education level are navigating. So these very complex policy landscapes makes it increasingly harder for undocumented students at a college level to actually persist or get through school in a really good and wholesome way, right? So for example, we think of there are state levels. So there are states that ban undocumented students from attending public institutions. So thinking about states like Alabama and Georgia, for example, that state that you cannot access a state institution. And, you know, a lot of undocumented folks are low income first gen. And so you find that they don't have the financial means to attend college that is private. You know, they're unable to access financial aid because of their status, and they're not going to access state aid based on where they're living. So we find that some states would give in-state tuition, for example, New York State, for example, and California, that are more undocu-friendly, but you have states that are more restrictive in nature. And then you have states that are limited in terms of how they give aid. So for example, states like Pennsylvania give aid to undocumented students, but you must have DACA. So the other issue is that DACA is tightly coupled to funding. And then
tell us briefly what DACA is.
So DACA stands for Deferred Action for Child Arrival, and it's administered under the Obama administration, that provided temporary status, 2-year status for folks who are undocumented, who entered the US before 2007, I think it was, 7. Did I get a 7? Yeah. So what's happening, I'm sorry. So what's happening is that, you know, folks who have DACA have a temporary reprieve. It doesn't mean that they're safe, right? They have a temporary reprieve, 2 years, and they have to constantly renew their DACA, which also is very costly. And then you have folks who we're seeing right now who do not have DACA, who do not have the protections of temporary stay of deportation. They cannot get social security numbers, they cannot get driver's license, and they cannot get any kind of state aid that is tied to DACA, or institutional aid or scholarship that is tied to DACA. So it makes it quite difficult for undocumented students. So what I'm really highlighting here is that even within the group, there are differences, right? So those who have DACA have access to a little bit more, not that they're safe, but they have access to a little bit more resources than those who do not have DACA, which makes it really complex for these students.
Yeah, Stefan, what do you want to add here?
Sure, yeah. Well, I want to echo the sentiments that my colleagues just shared. And to add, I think first I want to say that these folks are just brilliant, knowledgeable, talented folk, right? And that it's not always from a deficit perspective, right? Although there's a lot of like anti-immigrant sociopolitical climate issues, rhetoric, practices, and policies at all levels. And I love how Dr. Gutierrez has mentioned, taking us back to like meso level. Like, so, and when we think about these communities, we have to think micro, macro, meso levels, because it all impacts, right? And something that I always share too is policy is like number one. Law and policy is number one when we think about undocumented students, because there's all types of federal, state, and institutional level policies that are impacting these students, whether positively and or negatively, right? So that's something that, when we talk later on in conversation about kind of like implications or things that folks in higher ed and student affairs can consider in better supporting these folks, is really digging deeper into policies and investigating our institutional policies and trying to enact some transformational changes. But as Kayan shared and as Roseanne shared, right? So there's DACA. So when you talked about framing and like what kind of issues are happening, I mean, and these are not new, right? DACA, as Dr. Hall mentioned, was enacted as an executive order under the President Obama administration in 2012, which very limited community members from undocumented immigrant communities were eligible for that. One of the issues now is that once Trump became president and that administration began their journey in 2017, they rescinded that program, right? So since 2017, there hasn't really been access to any new applications to be reviewed and folks to be accepted. So the majority of our undocumented students now that are entering college do not have the protections of DACA, right? Do not have that 2-year renewal, which is a major issue, right? So DACA was never supposed to be a permanent fixture, right? It was always supposed to be something that was temporary, and unfortunately now we're year 12. And there has been no bipartisan agreement in Congress to pass some type of clear path to citizenship for not just undocumented students, but immigrants largely in this country, right? So that is a major issue that folks are facing, is not having any type of protections as they're navigating the world here in the States, but also on our college campuses. And as Kayan mentioned, there are some states that have been very intentional with only offering certain resources and benefits and scholarships and things of that nature to those who are DACA beneficiaries, but the majority of our students now are not, right? And when we think about kind of like the state level, so that's more like federal, at the state level, there's a lot going on right now. There's anti-immigrant policies that have been passed in states like Florida, in Texas, and Arizona. They're passing what we're calling now SB 17 2.0, which SB 17 was enacted in 2010, and it was basically the show me your papers law in the state of Arizona, where government officials and police can legally racially profile those who they deemed as immigrants, right? And unfortunately, the media has done a really good job at trying to portray who is an immigrant in this country, which there's really no one look to who an immigrant is, right? And not one experience. And they're proposing to reenact something similar there, right, in the state of Texas as well. So there's a lot of anti-immigrant legislation that's being proposed and possibly is going to be passed, unfortunately. And all of this impacts our college students. So we have to look at like the larger sociopolitical climate, the state level climate, because our students are not confined to a ball of our institutions, and even some of our institutions aren't protecting students, right? So we as higher education professionals and folks who say that we want to holistically support these students, we have to think beyond the parameters of our institutions.
Yeah. Stefan, could you tell us about the t-shirt you're wearing today for folks who can't see you? Could you tell us what it is
Sure,
and
it just
say a
says
little bit about it?
it just says unafraid educator and is basically someone who is an advocate, an outward ally, and co-conspirator to those that are in support of undocumented communities. So I identify as an unafraid educator and use my privileges as someone who is not undocumented, but has done a lot of work with undocumented immigrant communities in and outside of higher education, for good, right? And not to speak on behalf of them, but to speak in support and advocacy
Right.
efforts of them. So I am an unafraid educator in support of these communities.
I love it. I love it. And thanks for wearing that t-shirt today. We
Yeah,
love
of
it.
course.
Let's thank you for the macro, meso, micro levels, state and federal laws, the really great grounding here. But you've really expanded in this book. You've really worked hard to expand the perspective around undocumented students and who they are. So let's talk a little bit about that. And Kayan, I think you're going to kick us off here.
Sure. So there's this misconception that undocumented folks are Latine. And I think a lot of that probably is due to big D discourse. Like the media plays a significant role in shaping and fixing our understanding about particular issues. And so you look on the news and you look around, all folks who are undocumented are Latine. But that's not the case, right? So for me, I grew up in New York City, and there are lots of folks who are undocumented, but they're Black. And it's interesting the way how people constantly phrase it, because Black people move in the same ways as other people do. They are migrating, they are getting on planes, they're overstaying their visas, they are crossing physical land borders, right? So the idea that folks who are undocumented are not Black is a very flawed one. And so what happens is that you find that undocumented Black students are facing double invisibility, right? Because no one sees them, because they fall outside of our imagination of who could be undocumented. And so you find that they navigate different challenges, right? Because we're navigating a society that is very anti-Black in nature and anti-immigrant in nature. And so one could assume that, well, you're not dealing with the immigration aspect because you're not identified as being undocumented immediately, but you are navigating an anti-Black, very racist society. And so you find that many folks who are undocumented or Black are detained. They're navigating the criminal justice system. And so you're locked up, and then add your status on top of that, which compounds your experience. For undocumented Black students, they're a small percentage, undocumented individuals in general, they're a small percentage. So around about 10.5 million estimated are undocumented folks in the US. Of that number, about 600,000 are Black. And then looking at folks who are in higher education, about 14% of them, right? So a very small number. And I think that can add to the way how we come to understand this issue. But the reality of it is that if we understand that people move and that people are impacted by immigration and that there's structures in place, then we can understand that folks can be undocumented and Black at the same time. I think a lot about, thinking about undocumented folks and Black people in the United States in general. Sociologist Mary C. Waters talked a lot about the Caribbeanization of the US, in particular New York City, right? And thinking about proximity to the Caribbean, a lot of undocumented folks who are Black are coming from the Caribbean. So they're coming from islands like Jamaica, from Haiti, from Cuba, right? And other countries in Africa as well. And a lot of that, going back to Roseanne's comment earlier about kind of like in immigration policies, the Hart-Celler Act of 1965 really paved the way for a lot more Black immigrants to come to the US, right? And if you know how immigration works, right, people tend to keep on coming back for family reunification to decluster. And you find that New York City in particular has a very large Black immigrant community. So many of them are navigating CUNY and SUNY institutions. Some of the challenges that they face based on my conversation is that a lot of the scholarships are tied to folks from particular regions, right? They also are navigating, they're encountering faculty members and administrators who have a hard time understanding that they are Black and undocumented at the same time. One of the folks I spoke to in one of the studies I conducted said that, I said to her that I'm undocumented, and she said, but you have a high school diploma. Are you sure you're undocumented? And to question someone like that is just wild to me, right? Like, they're saying that they're undocumented, you're not believing them. They are hyper visible in the sense of racially, they're hyper visible, like navigating space, but they're invisible based on their immigration status. And that leads to feelings of isolation, mental health issues as well, because no one is really understanding their plights because they are Black and they fall outside of our social imaginaries about who an undocumented person is.
Yeah, I'd like to jump off of that. Oh, Keith, did you want to say something?
No, go. That's awesome. I was just going to say, you also want to complicate this in a different way. So go for it.
Yeah. A lot of, what Dr. Hall just said relates very much to the population that I work with and I'm familiar with, which is undocumented Asian or undocumented Asian American. So a lot of the things that, Dr. Hall mentioned is really touching up on this concept, racialized illegality. And Laura Enriquez, she's a sociologist, and she wrote about this comparison between Latinx students and Asian American students, where when it comes to racialized illegality, she defines this as, folks of racialized groups in the United States experience illegality or being undocumented differently and distinctly. And so when it comes to undocumented Asian and Asian Americans, they face this another term. Okay, I have another term for y'all. They experience the double bind. So Dr. Hall mentioned double invisibility for undocu Black students, and undocu Asian students experience this terminology called the double bind. And so this term was coined by sociologist Esther Yuna Cho, and Dr. Cho says that when it comes to undocumented Asian Americans, they are not necessarily racially profiled as undocumented. And what's working against them is this pesky stereotype that folks who study Asian Americans know very well is the model minority myth or model minority stereotype. And what the model minority myth or stereotype is it's this racialized narrative that Asians and Asian American students in higher education do not face challenges or issues or problems, and that they do very well in school, are successful, especially in subjects like STEM. And the other thing that I wanted to mention about the model minority myth is that it reproduces anti-Black logics. Because if you are propping and elevating one student group up, then you're basically saying, okay, cool, so why can't that other group do it? And when you think about the history of the model minority myth and stereotype, that really contemporarily took shape in the 1960s. And I say contemporarily because this can be traced all the way back in the 1800s. So what we know about the model minority myth today took shape in the 1960s during the height of the civil rights movement. The Black Power movement was gaining a lot of support and traction during that time. And conservatives needed a narrative to say, like, racism is not happening in the United States. So let's prop this group up to show people that, these folks who have experience being interned in Japanese internment camps or being excluded, like the Chinese individuals from the Chinese Exclusion Act, are doing well. So it's important that I give that history and context to be able to understand, the model minority stereotype as it affects our undocumented Asian students, because the ways it manifests in their lives is that they are rendered invisible within the entire conversation. This conversation, like, what Dr. Hall said, is very much racialized as a Latinx issue. And we're not necessarily saying that, that's it, because what we're saying is, yes, it is in a way, because there are a lot of Latinx folks, right? Mexico, Latin America, South America, that are affected by this. And at the same time, there are so many other people in these racialized groups who are also as well. And we need to put a lens on them and see that they go through these experiences as well. So for the students that I have worked with in the past, as it concerned my study, even for and the students that I have worked with are primarily live and have went to higher education institutions in California. We think of California as a predominantly supportive state for undocumented students, immigrants. And at the same time, my students who did go to these higher education institutions that did have support centers or undocumented spaces on campus still felt left out. They still felt like they actually did not belong in these spaces because it was very much racialized as a space that wasn't their own, whether that was language, symbols, food that they had at community gatherings. And so I think it's important for us to think, especially for those working with undocumented students as practitioners and even faculty, recognizing and unpacking even our own biases about who is included in this community, because there's not a specific look. There really isn't. You can't tell like, oh, you're undocumented, you know, like that's racist. I will call that out and say that is racist because you are thinking about a specific racialized stereotype about who you think is undocumented, right? Like I said before in the beginning, legality and undocumentedness has always been about who has shaped these conversations and these concepts and who has been in power. Nobody is inherently quote unquote illegal, you know, nobody's inherently undocumented. And so again, when it comes to the students that I've worked with, these students really felt like they didn't belong. And even when they told, so similarly to what Dr. Hall mentioned earlier, some of my students have even told people that, no, I am undocumented. So I have one particular student who was a student, what are they called? The students that give tours on campus. Why am I
tour guides?
There's a tour guide.
Admissions tour guide. Yeah.
Wow. We can play a game. We can play a game. I'd be like, what are the students called who give tours on campus? Tour guides. Oh my gosh, student tour guides. This is hilarious. So one of my participants said, she was a student tour guide. And so she would tell folks that she's undocumented, and she felt safe enough to share her story because she acknowledged that she's light-skinned, Korean American, and she's a woman. She knew how people perceived her already as not a threat based on society's understandings and imaginaries and associations of who is a threat in the society. So she felt like she could share. She wanted to use her position and privilege to be able to uplift other folks' stories who may not necessarily feel safe to do so. So she said, I'm undocumented, and people and some folks were so surprised. Some individuals would say, no, you're not. And again, back to Dr. Hall's point, you have an undocumented individual telling you they are undocumented and you don't believe them, which is wild to me, right? So again, it's really important for us, especially if you're working with undocumented students, that you really unpack and deconstruct the meanings that you associate with that term to people.
Great. Thank you. I love that we're complicating this and you're keeping us good on our history lessons here, Rosanna. I really appreciate it. I love it. More history. Stefan, what do you want to add?
Sure. Yeah. Well, one, I'm always in awe when I listen to these two brilliant scholars. So thank you. And for other folks who, please go read their scholarship, engage in their work, because it's brilliant and it's phenomenal. So thank you for allowing me to learn alongside you all today too. One, I love the different perspectives that we're getting in this conversation. Like Dr. Hall brought in like New York City and a lot of Black undocumented folks that are often invisible in conversations around undocumented student support on college campuses, right? Or around the larger immigration policy conversations largely in our nation, right? Roseanne talks a lot about undocumented Asian folk from different parts of the country as well. And although I work with all undocumented folk from various backgrounds, I think geographically it does play a large part. A lot of the students that I work with that are undocumented were from the state of Michigan, Texas, and Arizona predominantly, some border states, right, to Mexico. So a lot of Mexican undocumented folk and other folk from various countries in Latin and South America. And so I get to the privilege of working with a lot of Latinx undocumented students predominantly, right? And one thing that I actively try to do in my scholarship, this just reminded me as I'm thinking, Dr. Jesus Cisneros, who's a associate professor at the University of Texas, El Paso, and also does a lot of great work with and alongside and for undocumented students and undocumented queer students in particular, always was on my dissertation committee back in the day. And I remember him making this statement, like, we 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 are so accustomed in society to talk about the pobrecito narrative, right? So like
Yeah.
the poor people narrative, or the negative, the deficit narrative. But there's more, right, to undocumented folks. So I want to honor like Dr. Jesus Netos for bringing that into the conversation as I was a doc student navigating like this work and with these communities. And so one thing that I actively work on is trying to, yes, share the messy parts of what's happening at the institutional level, at the state level, at the federal level, right? Which is really important. We have to talk about that because that's real life stuff that's impacting these communities, but also like the other parts, like where are they finding joy, the assets and talents that they're bringing to our college campuses, right? How they're contributing to society. We are not a nation of immigrants, but the immigrants in our country have really worked and continue to do so much good for our country, right? And so that's what I try to bring into conversation in my work and with the communities that I get to work with. So you'll notice that I have multiple pieces around like literally the assets and talents that they're bringing to campus, and starting various initiatives that really our administrators and our institutional agents should be leading, like an undocumented mentoring program, or applying for grants and starting various initiatives. And I have students, undocumented students that started from scratch themselves, a scholarship program in the state of Arizona, right? So I try to elevate those narratives, so that way it's not always kind of like the needs only student and things of that nature, which, media does a really good job at that already. As placing folks from just a deficit perspective when really they're just human beings that are doing amazing things and thriving. And unfortunately, many are just faced with various barriers as they're trying to work on surviving and thriving outside of our college campuses. So, when we think about framing and expanding our approach to this work, that's something that I'm really intentional on, is really bringing out the assets and talents while also talking about the barriers and challenges, and trying to, dismantle whiteness and xenophobia and racist nativism and things of that nature that are all impacting these communities, but also like, let's shed light on the other aspects of who these humans are and how brilliant and talented that they are, and how privileged and honored we should be considering them to share space and offer their talents and their knowledge and skills on our college campuses nationwide.
Well, I love that. And I saw your piece in JCSD around Undocu-Joy. So I want to move us all into that space. So we have talked about some of the challenges, some of the legal issues, the issues of power, the issues of racism, all of these things, and the challenges that these students face. And how do we bring in, and I love a lot of the work in this book and in other places, as Stephen was just pointing to, is not just around the challenges, but also and issues of equity that we need to work on as unafraid educators, as institutions, but also you have an explicit focus on their humanity and their joy. So Stefan, I just want to invite you to say a little bit more about, you sort of previously said, here's why that is important. And we want to have this, this and conversation, right? We can talk about their thriving and their humanity and their joy without ignoring the challenges and the institutional barriers and things that they're facing and supports that they need. But let's bring in that and perspective here. What do you want to offer?
Yeah, thank you for asking, Keith. And I will say, I know Keith mentioned a couple of times this book, and for folks that aren't aware, it's a special issue that Keith is referencing in New Directions for Higher Ed. It came out November 2023, so more recently. I was a special issue editor, and these two brilliant scholars here, Dr. Gutierrez and Dr. Hall, also contributed articles to this this special issue. And the special issue is called Equitable and Humanizing Research Policy and Practice within Foreign Documented Collegians in the United States. So I, urge everyone to go and check it out, because there are 7 amazing articles, and then my intro editor's note chapter that really go, beyond the focus of just the pobrecito narrative, as we mentioned earlier, and really talk about humanizing and equitable policies and practices with and for and in support of undocumented students. So so the joy piece, the Undocu-Joy piece, is actually.
Look at you light up.
I know.
Look at you light up.
I'm excited. I'm excited about it, right? It's a piece that Dr. Hall and I wrote together, and it was just really a joy to write this piece, right? Dr. Hall and I talked a lot about one, just this notion of just bringing in other narratives beyond what the media usually portrays of who undocumented immigrants are, right? And we do get to experience a lot of painful moments with our undocumented students because life is life, and there's a lot of challenges and barriers as we described, but there's a lot of beautiful moments that we get to see and experience with them as well. So I remember Dr. Hall and I were just talking about joy and like working through our dissertation work. Separately, we went to different institutions, right? Obviously did different dissertations, but with similar populations. And we talked about how there was a lot of joy, throughout the narratives as well. And how can we, bring that to the forefront? And I will add, or preface by saying, we didn't we didn't coin the term undocu joy, right? So there's undocumented scholars who have coined that term, but from our knowledge, there hasn't been any like peer review empirical articles around undocu joy particularly, right? So we do credit people like Yosimar Reyes, which is an undocumented advocate and artist out of California, who wrote a poem on undocu joy, right? And something that we share in this piece is when I went to NCORE, the National Conference on Race and Ethnicity in 2019, I believe, I met Yosimar Reyes, and in his session, he said, I urge you all that are doing work and research and community work alongside these communities to bring out more of joyful conversations, right? Bring out more. And that I remember writing down that note, and I said, this is happening, right? So then Dr. Hall and I got together, and we're like, we have data, we have experiences, and let's bring that into conversation. So we highlight Yosimar Reyes and that poem. We open up the article in the Journal of College Student Development, and that also came out in the fall of 2023. And it's just again another framing, another perspective, and saying there is joy amidst the chaos, amidst anti-immigrant sentiments and policies and practice. There is joy. So we bring out like stories of their artistic joy and how the students and former students who are undocumented used different forms of art, whether that's spoken word, whether that's drawing for healing and things of that nature, familial joy, community joy, right? And the people, places, and things that are literally bringing them joy and what they're doing in their lives to continue to maintain hope and joy amidst the chaos again. So that's something that we thought was really important and we wanted to highlight in this piece. And we just hope that it is an added contribution to scholarship around this topic of undocumented students. Candy,
Roseanne, I see you vibing.
No, I just love this. I'm just a joyful person. And so as I hear you talk, Dr. Santa Ramirez, about this, I just also light up. And I know Dr. Hall, this is also your piece with him, so I'd love to hear what you think about this. But I'm currently working on a manuscript right now that talks about like undocu joy within the perspectives of the participants I've worked with. And so I was thinking about this when I was doing my study, and it was my dissertation. And I was like, I want to go beyond ethics. As researchers, we're taught to be ethical, and then we have to fill out the IRB, you have to follow a set of ethics, there's principles. I said, okay, cool, blah blah blah. But at the same time, when it comes to our students and the population I work with, they're already very much experiencing trauma in their lives on a daily basis. How do I treat them, not just as participants, not just like as quote unquote subjects of a study? How do I do this work with them and for them and bring out those conversations in a way through my methods that captures their humanity? And so I did a photo elicitation method. It was a multi-phase study, and one of the methods was photo elicitation. So I asked them to take photos of places that made them feel like they belonged as an undocumented Asian person. And this is the part of the research that they enjoyed the most, because they have not never, but a lot of the times folks don't ask, especially researchers, folks don't ask them what brings you happiness and joy. Researchers often want trauma or damage-centered narratives, as
say that again. Say that again.
Damage, not me coming up with concepts again. Damage centered narratives. So there is damage centered narratives is this concept that Dr. Eve Tuck came up with and written about and conceptualized, that when we think about social science research, oftentimes researchers associate rich data with damage
trauma.
and trauma.
Mhm.
And that is harmful to the communities that we, serve and want to work with and really want to learn about. So how do we create, actual narratives that inspire like critical hope and joy, right? And so I think that's for all of us, and I'll just speak for all of us, correct me if I'm wrong. I'll speak for all of us that, we want to humanize the ways that we work with undocumented students and folks. And so I think for me, I'll give you all one tangible example. Two. Well, yeah, two of my participants, said that when it comes to curating their space, so their rooms, their rooms in their living spaces, they're very intentional about it. So, but two of them put posters like on the corners or their walls, and have photos of friends and just put things that are important, because especially for one of them, she's been houseless before. So this is the first time that she has been able to create a space of her own, even if it's in the corner of her bedroom. And to be able to hear that in her story through the photo that she took, you wouldn't be able to necessarily capture that in interview data. And so the other one has moved constantly for most of their lives. And I've known this individual, and they have moved every like 6 months of their lives. And so this precarity when it comes to housing, right? We don't think about that in association to Asian Americans. So like I said before, they experience this double bind where they're shielded from, being racialized as undocumented, while at the same time not receiving the support that they need because people do not think they're undocumented. So I bring all this up because I think for all of us, it's important to think about, especially as researchers, important to think about what are the methods or really the ways we engage with folks in research, especially undocumented folks, that brings out and captures their humanity, their happiness. Because even in the term even undocumented, right? Like that doesn't encapsulate who they are as human beings, first and foremost.
Yeah, it's also a deficit term, right?
Very
Yeah,
so.
yeah. Go on,
Yeah.
Dr. Hall. I know you're ready.
Blazing. Sorry. No, so I love the conversation about joy, and kind of like going back to Roseanne's comment about Eve Tuck's work around damage-centered research. I think a lot, I think of myself as an interdisciplinary scholar, and I pull heavily from Black studies and sociology to shape the way how I think about things. And I think a lot about the work of Elizabeth Alexander around the Black interior, right? And so she's saying that we can acknowledge that these things are existing for Black folks, that we're navigating a very anti-Black space, a very white supremacist space. But what about the life-giving moments that are happening simultaneously, the interior, right? And so I think a lot about my work in that way as well, to kind of like depart from these very damage-centered narratives, and how can I invite more spaces or more narratives where undocumented folks are able to talk about their wonderful time. And so I use very specific methodologies in my piece in the book, the Stephan edited. I use wake work coming from Christina Sharp, that's saying that, we exist in this world that's racist, but we have to find a way to exist within the wake, and that's doing wake work. And wake work, she didn't conceptualize what that may look like. It looks like differently for different people. So wake work could be, in the piece that I wrote, choosing to study abroad despite the complications that could happen. The fact that you may not be let back into the country even though you have advanced parole, that's wake work. Is intentionally choosing to enjoy your time with your family and your friends. And these are joyous things as well. And so I think that for me, it's important to do that work. And so also in a study I'm conducting currently right now, I'm asking folks to talk about, what does liberation look like for you? What does that mean? And so going back to damage-centered research and Roseanne's comment that we are prepared and trained to go into the fields, to think about ethical considerations, how to collect data, how to do IRB, but very rarely, and correct me if I'm wrong, are we asked to think about what does it mean when we're leaving the fields? And I
Mm.
think that Eve kind of gets at that in her comment about Demo-centered research. And so for me, I try to be very intentional about closing out my studies with something that kind of returns you to a space of happiness. So in the study I'm doing right now, I ask folks to send me a love letter, to write a love letter to themselves, to kind of round it out. Because I see it as coming in and I'm asking you questions. You're talking about anti-Blackness. You're talking about the challenges you're facing as someone who doesn't have status.
Mhm.
And these things really drum a lot of trauma in your body that just lodges within you and is harmful. So I never want to leave my interview or my conversations with undocumented folks on that note. And so I wrap up my conversation with write a love letter to yourself, and I want you to return to it. So you can come back to a place that settles you. And that to me is a form of joy. That to me is a form of wake work. And that to me is the ways that I respond to the call from folks like Eve Tuck to depart from damage-centered research and damage-centered practices.
Yeah. I love it. And I think there's clearly implications around doing research and serving undocumented students, but there's so many more implications far beyond that. And when we're talking about damage-centered research, you're also checking off some of my favorite words like hope, critical hope, liberation, joy. If we could work agency in there, we'd win a bingo somewhere along the way.
Sprinkle.
Yeah. Well, this has been fabulous. I really appreciate all of your contributions and your framing, your context, your details, your offerings. But we're running out of time. So this podcast is called Student Affairs Now, and I always like to end by asking our guests, what is with you now? What are you thinking? What are you troubling? What are you pondering? Maybe related to this conversation or other things. And if you want to share where folks can connect with you, please go ahead and do that. Roseanne, you're a joyful person, you said. So what is with you now?
What's with me now is a question, as always, that I will not be answering, and I don't expect y'all to answer, but I think especially for our audience members or those listening, is really thinking about, given the current socio-political climate right now, specifically as we think about anti-immigrant and just a hostile climate for undocumented immigrants, our students, is that what will it take for us to build together while dismantling our current systems? And building together is going to take a lot of work. And I think people need to remember that this is work that those before us have done, right? It's not going to happen overnight. So again, what will it take for us to continue to build together collectively while dismantling our current systems?
Yeah.
I love that. You're reminding me of one of my favorite lessons from community researcher and builder Peter Block, who said, focus less on the problems. Solutions are better, but they're still rooted in the problems, and focus on possibilities. So what are we building? What are we creating? What are we co-creating? What are we doing? And I love you've all said it here, but you also make it really explicit in a lot of your work, is the with in the with and for undocumented students.
Yeah.
So co-creating along the way. Great.
Yeah.
Go ahead. Kayan?
Yeah, I think also what's on my mind, and I think it's on Stefan's and Roseanne's mind too, it's, DACA folks are aging out. They've aged out. And so we are educating folks who are undocumented without the protections of DACA. And so how will universities respond to supporting their needs? What does that look like? How are we preparing them for postgraduate experiences, right? And so these are things that we have to really spend some time to think about collectively, to Roseanne's point, but how can we actually support and serve these students, right? Yeah.
Beautiful. Stefan, what are you pondering, troubling, or thinking
a
about
lot.
now?
Something that a couple of things. I'm having this conversation and having so many of us talk about these beautiful and brilliant folks that we get to work with all the time. I'm really thankful, right? I'm thankful that they've opened up their hearts and their lives and their space to us over the years, and they continue to do so. So I do want to honor that, right? Because we don't do this work for ourselves. We do it for them and in support of, just more equitable policies and practices, largely for undocumented students and immigrants across the country. So that's something that's on my heart right now, is just how thankful I am to be in community with these beautiful and brilliant folks who just so happen to be undocumented. Um, something else that's been on my heart lately too is how our institutions can be doing more to support these students. And why I'm saying this, because I've been at two institutions in the recent years that that call themselves kind of like undocu-friendly and sanctuary spaces for undocumented immigrant students, yet they have invited Border Patrol agents to career fairs to recruit students, right? And so we can't use these terms like we're being undocu-friendly, we're being inclusive, and we're going to actively work on recruiting these college students, yet our policies and practices aren't matching the words, right? Or aren't matching what you're saying that you're supporting, and especially if you're calling yourself a sanctuary campus or a sanctuary space. So that's something that's been sitting with me a lot over the years, but also more recently, because we're still in 2024 and I'm still hearing stories of this. So my challenge to folk that work in and outside of higher ed is to really critically critique what's going on campus, right? And are we actually just talking to talk, or we're walking the talk, right? And are we critically critiquing what we're doing on campus within our policies and practices? And if we're going to call ourselves sanctuary campuses or undocu-friendly campus or inclusive campuses for marginalized or minoritized communities, then we need actual policies to defend that, right? Like, for example, like policies that say we are not going to invite Border Patrol agents on our college campus, career fair, non-career fair, right? And some institutions have been leading the way in those regards, and a lot haven't, right? So for me, I'm all about action items and not about words. Words mean nothing, not in my personal life, not in my professional life. Words mean nothing to me. Don't tell me you're sorry unless you show me, in your actions, that it's not going to happen again, or that you're sorry means it, right? And I feel the same way about what we need to be doing at the institutional level. And yeah, so that's something that's been on my mind and on my heart lately. And I just urge folk to just critically critique their policies and practices. And if there is none, identify some, right? And if we're saying that we actually want to support students, because we can provide access all day long, but if our students are not feeling like they belong, not feeling like they're a part of the community, don't feel like they can persist toward graduation, retention rates are low, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera, then we're not doing our job at really supporting the students.
Yeah. Wonderful. Wonderful. Well, thank you all so much. This has been terrific. It's been a beautiful conversation. So I really appreciate all of you, your scholarship, your research, your leadership in this space, and for sharing it with us today. Thank you all so much. I also want to thank our sponsors of today's episode, Rutledge and Huron. Rutledge, Taylor & Francis is the world's leading academic publisher in education, publishing a wide range of books, journals, and other resources for practitioners, faculty, administrators, and researchers. They have welcomed stylish publishing to their publishing program and are thrilled to enrich their offerings in higher education, teaching, student affairs, professional development, assessment, and more. As a proud sponsor of Student Affairs Now, you can view their complete catalog of education titles at rutledge.com/education. And Huron is a global professional services firm that collaborates with clients to put possible into practice by creating sound strategies, optimizing operations, accelerating digital transformation, and empowering businesses and their people to own their future. By embracing diverse perspectives, encouraging new ideas, and challenging the status quo, Huron creates sustainable results for the organizations they serve. As always, a huge shout out to our producer, Natalie Ambrosi, who does all the work behind the scenes to make all of us look and sound good. And we love the support of these important conversations from you, those of you in our community. You can help us reach even more folks by subscribing to the podcast on YouTube and to our weekly newsletter, where we share our new episodes every week on Wednesdays. If you're so inclined, you can leave us a 5-star review. It really helps these conversations, like today's powerful conversation, reach an even broader audience. I'm Keith Edwards. Thanks to our fabulous guests today, to everyone who is watching and listening. Make it a great week. Thank you all.